Manhwa title in the right corner of the screen. Enjoy watching.
Letitia turned around when she heard someone calling her name. Her eyes were wide with surprise, clearly not expecting to be addressed. Suddenly, a guy appeared in front of her, gently took her hand and bending down kissed her fingers. With a warm smile, he said, "I wish you happiness." But before Letitia could respond, another guy appeared next to her. He confidently grabbed her hand, squeezing it tighter than necessary, and with a slight smirk on his lips, he whispered, "You are the only one who is allowed to touch me." Both pulled her towards themselves, as if trying to divide her between themselves, shouting over each other with the same call, "Letitia! Letitia!" The girl's heart sank with irritation, and unable to bear it, she exhaled sharply, "What the—" But at that moment, something inside her snapped. She closed her eyes and froze, gradually calming down, and thoughts rushed through her head. This doesn't feel like a normal game. Shouldn't I just be a background character? Letitia sank into her thoughts sadly, feeling confused and weak. How to tell them apart? She thought over and over again. For example, when she tried to find at least some sign, even the smallest detail that could reveal the truth. She slowly opened her eyes and tears flowed down her cheeks, leaving transparent traces on her skin. The same handsome guys were still standing around her, holding her hands tightly, as if not wanting to let go. Their gazes remained full of desire, persistence, and a strange attraction that did not allow her to break free from their tenacious attention. Suddenly, a girl burst into this tense silence, her voice sharp and envious. Her eyes flashed, and her face was frozen in an expression of venomous mockery. "My God, what indecency!" she exclaimed, not hiding her contempt. Behind them, there was a quiet murmur of laughter. The two girls who had come with the envious guest were barely holding back their sly smiles. One of the boys slowly leaned towards Letitia and gently touched her lips, sealing a kiss filled with passion and determination. At that moment, the second boy, unable to bear it, lowered his gaze, retreating into the shadows. Disappointment gripped his heart, and a tear rolled down his cheek, silent but bitter, like a sign of lost hope. Suddenly, an inspiration appeared before the desperate boy, as if materialized from the very determination. His voice sounded sharp but confident. "And how long are you going to whine? You are not going to just let him take your love away?" There was no pity in his words, only a challenge and the fire of struggle. All this time, the girl standing behind them had been involuntarily eavesdropping on their conversation. What she heard struck her to the depths of her soul. Shock, bordering on confusion, flashed in her gaze. So, such a character. No matter how much he tries, no matter how much he fights, he will never be the center of attention. His image will not appear in anyone's memories, will not leave a trace. Just the role of someone who was in the right place at the right time, and nothing more. Letitia realized with sad clarity. The role that came to me after reincarnation. Letitia sat on the bed, looking at her hands in fear. "Huh?" A trembling whisper escaped her, as if she was trying to comprehend who she had become and what was happening around her. Strange sounds came from the windows of the building, an ominous laugh echoing through the corridors. Hee hee hee! Immersed in loneliness, Letitia sat in her room, her gaze full of sadness and inevitable humility. The Duke. He is the Duke, and he is my fiancé. These words sounded to her like a sentence, and not like a promise of happiness. But another girl, Alexia, running around the palace and dancing, exclaimed with delight, "We will meet soon, hee hee hee. I'm sure he will be as cool as the prince." Her caustic words continued to hurt Letitia, who sat behind her. Each jab sounded like a deliberate reminder of her place. Letitia. Alexia's voice was heard, full of feigned sympathy. Running up to her, Alexia grinned and waving her hand mockingly said, "You'll never be so lucky. Ho ho ho, not your level." Letitia slowly placed the cup on the table, maintaining an outward calm, although inside everything was clenching with disappointment. With restraint but with a slight note of bitterness in her voice, she replied, "You will be engaged to the Duke himself. How wonderful, Alexia." At that moment, a servant entered the room, saying respectfully, "Madam, you need to get ready." In the background, Letitia, barely audible, said to herself, "But this engagement—" Holding the cup with trembling hands, Letitia tried to maintain her composure. Tears glistened in her eyes, and in the silence of the room she whispered in her mind, "After her, I will be replaced, right? It is also thanks to you." Alexia approached her servants, handed one of them a small package, and ordered with a grin on her face, "Do everything properly." Then, mocking Letitia, she slowly poured the liquid from the glass onto the fresh roses, as if performing a ritual. "A greedy and arrogant nature," she said in a hoarse whisper, as if to herself. The scene was like a scene from that Otomi game I played in a past life. She was the villain, predatory and ruthless. I stood in front of the mirror looking at my reflection with obvious displeasure. Thoughts were whirling through my head. Do I have the same face as Alexia? This realization was more pressing than any words. In the universe of this game, I played the role of the cruel Alexia's younger twin sister, Letitia, Lambert. Too similar on the outside, but so different on the inside. According to the plot, Alexia had a fiancé, the Duke himself, but he was not at all to her taste. And so, without thinking, she handed it over to me, as if it were an unnecessary toy. With feigned indifference, she exclaimed, "Prince, I no longer have a fiancé, so I am free. And it looks like this turn of events will happen very soon," I thought with a heavy sigh, already sensing the approach of the inevitable. Even her parents, bowing before Alexia, could not help but notice her change. "What happened to you suddenly after returning from the Duke's estate, Alexia?" they asked, alarm sounding in their voices. But they still did not dare to go against her will. Alexia lay on the bed, her body shaking from violent coughing fits. The doctor, who had examined her not for the first time, shook his head and said doubtfully, "I've examined her several times, but her health should be fine." A thought occurred to Letitia inside. Malingering? But she didn't dare voice her suspicions. Alexia, coughing weakly, looked up at her parents and quietly, almost plaintively, whispered, "Father, Mother." Her parents only sighed heavily in response. Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke in a sad, broken voice. I can't marry the Duke with such health. If we don't do anything, we'll cause problems for Mr. Lionel. So it's better that instead of me." For a moment, a hidden smirk flashed in her eyes as she finished with feigned sadness. "He'll marry a healthy..." The hint was obvious, and her gaze slid towards Letitia. Letitia, noticing this treacherous gesture, looked at her lying sister with surprise and nervous tension in her eyes. Her heart sank with anxiety. She understood where this was all heading. Father, holding Alexia's hand, said with grim determination, "I understand. I will petition the Duke to replace you with Letizia. The main thing is that you recover." Letitia looked down, disappointment slowly filling her heart. Her thoughts were tangled, like a ball of threads in which there was no beginning. "I have no choice," flashed through her mind. "In this world, the degree of mastery of magic is of great importance, and my abilities are meager. So I don't blame them for this attitude," she told herself, trying to convince her heart that everything that was happening was just a consequence of the cruel rules of this world. And then a clear thought suddenly occurred to Letitia. I am not replacing Alexia, but perhaps this is my own path. It was not a sacrifice. It was her destiny, even if invisible to others. In a land where magic was prized above all else, because it sustained the life force of the land itself, Letitia had no choice. It couldn't be helped, she thought with a heavy heart. Soon they were standing at the entrance, going down to the prepared carriage. The servants gathered around, all with their eyes downcast. The father, holding back his emotions, said in a firm voice, "Please, be as polite as possible in the estate of the Duke of Legrand." The parents said goodbye with tears in their eyes. The mother, wiping her face with a handkerchief, tried not to show her daughter her pain. The father said, looking down, "Forgive me, Letitia, for placing such responsibility on you." However, the girl, contrary to expectations, smiled with a slight joy, feeling a strange calm inside. She squeezed her father's hand tightly and replied, "It's all right. I knew what role I would have. To be a background heroine who marries the Duke instead of my sister is my destiny." The parents looked at each other in surprise, not understanding what role she was talking about. But Letitia, already in the moving carriage, shouted cheerfully, "Well, that's it, I'm going." All this time, Alexia watched their farewell from the balcony. A shadow of emotion flashed across her face, either disappointment or envy, but her expression quickly became cold and indifferent again. Letizia, rocking in the carriage, looked thoughtfully out the window. A surprised, almost incredulous thought sounded in her thoughts. And yet, how strange. Could it be that a young man decided to marry me, the heroine of the background? Recalling the events of the day, she sighed, "By the way, Today, Laurent, the son of Count Richard, expressed a desire to marry me. Sadness grew inside and tears welled up in her eyes. I even feel a little sorry for Alexia. Flashed through her head. When I played, I felt this too, didn't I? Letitia gathered her thoughts. First of all, I need to apologize for the situation with my sister. She walked down a long corridor lined with silent servants. Letitia looked down, feeling the walls pressing down on her with their luxury. The Automy game itself will take place 5 years from now in a school for aristocrats, she remembered. An image of Lionel from the game popped into her mind. He was sluggish and, as far as I remember, far from the most popular character. The door opened in front of her. The girl slowly entered the room with her gaze downcast, trying to hide her excitement. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, she suddenly froze. Surprise reflected on her face. In front of her, at the table in a large chair, sat a small boy carefully writing lines on paper with a pen. This is Lionel? Flashed through her mind. Then a light, sincere smile appeared on her lips. So first I need to greet him. Hello, she said softly. Bowing gracefully, she added politely, I am the second daughter of Count Lambert. My name is Letitia. Lambert. Letitia wants to say, nice to meet you, but only manages to say the first word, nice to meet you. At that moment, Lionel looks up and his eyes meet hers. Letitia freezes, looking at him with loving eyes. How cute he is. She couldn't take her eyes off him. A thought crossed her mind. Wow, he's a little chubby, but when he loses weight, he'll be even cuter, right? And she suddenly thought that maybe he hadn't thought about it himself. At this point, he uttered only one word. Listen. Letitia couldn't help but come closer, and her gaze became even more affectionate. Ha, isn't he cute? She thought. He in turn looked at her with surprise. Lionel never had a chance to say anything, and Letitia, lost in her thoughts, thought, Lionel is an unpolished gem that must shine. Now that I have been reincarnated, with a determined look and clenched fists, Letitia quietly whispered to herself, I want to polish this man to a shine. Letitia stands in front of Lionel with an insistent gaze and her hands clenched into fists. An anxious voice sounds in her thoughts. This is our first meeting, and I'm looking at him so intently because of my excitement. I need to calm down. What should I do? I can't let him think I'm rude. At this point, Lionel rises from his chair, his movements smooth and reserved. He says with slight shyness, Please forgive me for being late with my greeting. Letitia immediately lowers her gaze, feeling awkward and embarrassed. Then the young man adds with respect, Hello, I am the eldest son of the Duke of Legrand. He bows gracefully, ending the introduction softly, Lionel Legrand. At this moment, Letitia cannot hide the delight in her thoughts. Magnificent! He is only a year older than me, but in every movement of his there is refinement and grace. With what impeccability he performs this complex medieval bow. Monsieur Lionel is not only nice, he is perfect in every detail. Lionel, visibly embarrassed, awkwardly suggests, if you don't mind, I can show you the garden. Letitia, with a slight smile, wonders in her mind, is he nervous? She replies with benevolent confidence, Yes, of course, that would be nice. Lionel, with a timid smile, replies, Oh, okay. They leave the room into the corridor, and the conversation continues. Lionel, trying to hide his embarrassment, says, Now, in our garden, you can see flowers that bloom only at this time of year. I thought I would like to show them to you, Madame Letitia. The girl watches him with surprise and warmth, listening attentively to every word, and her smile becomes even softer. As soon as he finishes, she looks him straight in the eye and replies, Then I need to tell the servant. New thoughts arise inside her. Monsieur Lionel is so magnificent, but why does he lack self-confidence? This is only our first meeting, and I already want to help him open up. Maybe because we are similar? In this game, we are both background characters. Here they finally come out into the garden. A spacious alley stretches out before them, in the center of which rises a large fountain with elegant statues. Around them are slender trees, and behind the fountain one can see a white gazebo with a soft blue roof and delicate patterns. Letitia, with a bright fire in her eyes, exclaims enthusiastically, Wow! In her thoughts, she notes with admiration, Indeed, the Duke's property? The garden alone is twice as big as our house, so huge that walking around it is already a serious physical effort. She slows down for a moment, feeling slightly tired. Letitia's eyes sparkle when she notices the flowers, shimmering in every shade of pink. She says quietly with genuine happiness, What beautiful flowers. Then she adds with a warm smile, and I'm so glad we came here. Monsieur Lionel, thank you for this lovely stole. Lionel, slightly embarrassed, comes closer, holding a warm blanket in his hands. His voice sounds soft, with a slight uncertainty. The wind is a little cold today, if you don't mind. He carefully holds out the blanket to Letitia. I am so happy about this feeling, when you are treated with such respect. At home, I was never spoiled with such care. Flashes through the girl's thoughts. Memories of home flash through her mind. Alexia laughing and falsely affectionate. How sweet, he will be mine. Her father, with a tired expression on his face, lowering his eyes. Sorry, Letitia. Letizia, resolutely taking Lionel by the hands, leads him along the flowering flower beds. She says with sincere admiration, the flowers are amazingly beautiful, sir. Suddenly, Lionel loses his balance and falls to the ground. Letitia, with horror in her eyes, jumps up. Lionel! She sits down next to him, fear gripping her heart. Her voice trembles with excitement. Are you okay? Did you hurt yourself? Lionel, coughing weakly, answers barely audibly. I'm fine. Just a little tired. Sorry, Mrs. Letitia, go without me. The girl squeezes his hands tightly, smiling encouragingly. There's not much left, right? We'll manage together. Without letting go of his hand, she gently suggests, let's just slow down. We're in no hurry, Monsieur Lionel. Shall we go together? Lionel looks up at her, his eyes filled with fatigue, sadness, and something elusive, as if he were struggling with an invisible pain he couldn't say out loud. Letitia continues to hold his hand, but then she catches herself thinking, I didn't think that it might seem intrusive. She feels her fingers squeeze his palm too tightly. Calm down, Letitia. You're getting hot-tempered today. They look at each other, Letizia with a fire of determination in her eyes, and Lionel with a deep, barely concealed sadness. Their glances seem to intersect on the edge of two worlds. Her world is a world of hope and care. His is a world of loneliness and the weight of unbearable responsibility. Letitia turns her face away slightly, hiding her growing disappointment. However, Lionel continues to hold her hand, as if afraid of losing that rare sincerity that emanates from the girl. The people who created the game could not even see his true charm. They enter a spacious hall where a long table is laid out with many exquisite sweets. Letizia, amazed by this magnificence, involuntarily exhales, "Ah!" Unable to resist, she sits down at the table, picks up an elegant fork and tries the first piece. Her face instantly lights up with happiness. Each taste seems to open a new world of pleasure. Everyone nearby smiled reservedly, watching the girl's sincere joy. Even the servants, who usually strictly adhered to etiquette, could not hide their warm smiles. Letizia happily takes piece after piece, enjoying every second. Behind her, the servants watch her sincere emotions with interest, and Lionel, standing next to her, smiles slightly. At home, Alexia always eats almost all the sweets, but here there are so many that I will get some too, Letizia rejoices to herself. At that time, Lionel thinks, it seems that Madame Letizia really liked our patisserie. But suddenly the girl freezes, puts her fork on the plate, and with slight curiosity to Lionel, and you won't eat? Or do you just not like sweets? Lionel, who was already sitting opposite her, lowered his gaze slightly and answered reservedly, it's not that I don't like it, it's just that when a person's magical power is stronger than others, especially at a young age, it becomes more difficult to control it. He folds his hands on the table, his voice growing sadder. So I tried to eat more so that my body would grow faster and be able to withstand this force. But I think I overdid it a little. Looking up at Letitia, his eyes were slightly desperate. I think my efforts are pointless. After all, if I, the heir of the Duke, look unattractive, what good will it do? That's why I'm abstaining from sweets now. Letitia, looking at Lionel with a soft sadness in her eyes, thinks to herself, he was probably often teased for his appearance. Just like me once. It seems that our fates are surprisingly similar. Memories start to come back, like an old pain coming back to life. An image of a guy from the past pops into her mind, looking down at her with a mocking smile. Oh, excuse me. Have you been standing here for long? What's your name? Other taunts echoed in her head. It doesn't matter whether you're here or not, he grinned. You're too serious. And to be honest, completely unattractive. Even my parents' words echoed with pain. You won the competition again? You're our good girl. Your younger sister is no good in that regard. In my past life, I was also like a hero without recognition. I always tried, but never lived up to their expectations. They didn't even notice my efforts. She remembers herself sitting in a room, wrapped in a blanket like a cocoon. I locked myself in my shell so that no one would hurt me again. Suddenly, Lionel spoke, pulling Letitia out of her heavy memories. His voice was hesitant but sincere. Part of me wants to live up to my status as the Duke's heir, but he looked down, his fingers tightening on the cup. I don't want to listen to those who say that I'm not worthy anymore. Letitia looks at him in surprise, struck by his honesty and the pain hidden behind his words. That's how it is. He's really trying to change. Lionel, having calmed down a little, takes the cup and takes a sip of tea, as if trying to hide behind this simple act. And Letitia, without taking her eyes off him, thinks he wants to become the hero of his own life. She grips her cup tighter with both hands, looking into its smooth surface as if it were a mirror of her own thoughts. I want to help him with this. She still holds the cup, not taking her eyes off him. There is sadness in her eyes, mixed with concern and determination. She understands that before her stands not just a boy from a noble family, but a man who needs support as much as she once did. They continue to sit at the table, immersed in a quiet but sincere conversation. Letitia gathers her courage and, looking straight at Lionel, says, "One can only look at your manners with admiration. They are so graceful and refined." Lionel is slightly embarrassed. His gaze moves away, but he answers warmly, "At the very beginning, I couldn't do it at all. But after much practice, I think I began to understand something." Letitia, blushing slightly, adds, trying to speak softly but confidently, "But still, I understand that for controlling magic, a large body helps better than a small one. But is this really the only way? In manga, for example, people train their bodies to gain control over their power. An image of a kung fu master instructing a student pops into her mind. Strengthen your willpower, the stern voice of the teacher sounds. Letitia tilts her head slightly, thinking, body training? Could that work? In her mind, she can already imagine what Lionel would look like if he started working out. Tall, with abs of steel and a confident posture. Mr. Lionel with abs of steel. Too good to be true? She almost laughed at the absurdity of her own fantasy. Suddenly struck by an idea, Letitia stands up abruptly from the table, confidently resting her palm on its surface, and says, "Do you want to try training your body?" Lionel blinks in surprise, not quite understanding what he's talking about. "Train? Your body?" Letitia explains enthusiastically, emphasizing each word. "I mean increasing it through muscle mass." Lionel, still not fully understanding, frowned and asked again with obvious bewilderment, "Muscle? Mass?" His voice sounded not only surprised, but also slightly confused. He clearly did not expect such a proposal from Letitia. A view of a majestic palace illuminated by the rays of the sun. From its spacious windows come the muffled sounds of counting. Inside the palace, Letitia stands next to Lionel, holding his back with her hands, helping him maintain his balance. 10, she says firmly. Having finished the exercise, Letitia claps her hands with a smile. "That's it. Excellent work as always, Mr. Lionel." Lionel, all sweaty but with shining eyes, looks at her with genuine happiness. "Thank you very much for helping me again today." He raises his hand to stretch his shoulder and, still smiling, admits, "Still, stretching my legs is difficult for me. I'll have to try my best." Letitia, watching him with a slight smile and a gleam in her eyes, thinks to herself, "Dazzling." Embarrassed, she softly replies, "It doesn't have to be my best. The main thing is to keep trying." Her eyes are full of admiration. She sees how he is growing not only physically, but also internally. Letitia's inner voice sounds with surprise. If you pay attention, he has noticeably lost weight, stretched out. Now his physical form is in perfect order. Unable to contain herself, Letitia covers her face with her hand, holding back her tears. Lionel, noticing this, stops and looks at her with a worried look. This is the result of that same improvement in physical condition that we began that day. Her mental voice sounds. Mentally, with irony. "In the plank, you can't lower your hips." Lionel asks again in confusion. Plank?" Letitia wipes away a tear, chuckling softly. "I never knew that all those weight loss videos I watched in my past life would be so helpful. Although in this world, training is mostly associated with swordsmanship. Her imagination paints a simple but clear picture. Sword, for training the body. Magic, for increasing the body of the vessel. Rumors begin to spread throughout the palace. Have you heard? Mr. Lionel has started training. Yes, they say he is being taught some strange movements. Letitia's thought is heard off-screen. However, despite the bewilderment of those around him, Mr. Lionel gradually began to gain control over his magic. Lionel became more confident with each passing day, and Letitia felt that perhaps for the first time in her life, she could truly help someone. I began to feel that the distance between me and the Legrand family was gradually decreasing. Approached Letitia. The mother, with tears in her eyes and a warm smile, said, "Thank you, Mrs. Letitia." The father nodded reservedly, adding, "You are welcome to visit our house whenever you wish." Letitia almost laughed to herself. I will never admit to anyone that initially I just wanted to see the muscles on their son's stomach. Lionel's parents, no longer holding back tears of happiness, add, "Thanks to you, our son has shone brighter than ever before." These words shake Letitia to the depths of her soul. She did not expect to hear such a thing. After thinking for a moment, she quietly says, "I helped Mr. Lionel a little?" Lionel's parents never answered. Lionel and Letitia are already sitting at the table. Lionel is calmly drinking tea, and Letitia, holding a cup, looks at him attentively and with surprise. Then she puts on a slight smile and decides to ask, "By the way, why did you listen to me on the very first day of our meeting?" The guy shyly and with a slight smile on his face answers, "It's..." Looking down, he finishes, "A secret." After that, he looks up at Letitia, his gaze darkening a little. "And why, you helped me?" The girl shudders slightly, surprised by his question, but still answers, I suggested it to you myself," she adds a little more confidently. In her thoughts, she admits, "I wanted to make sure you could handle it." Lionel answers reservedly, "Thank you very much, although at first I was worried. He seemed weak to me." However, she thinks. Memories flash before her eyes. Lionel runs and suddenly stops, choking from coughing. "Mr. Lionel, are you okay?" Letitia asks in fear. He, breathing heavily, replies, "It's better to finish running for today." In her memories, Lionel, having rested a little, continues to run again, not giving up. He tried hard, despite his fatigue. In the present, Lionel continues to drink tea calmly. Letitia looks at him with admiration and thinks, "I wouldn't be surprised if he was training even when I wasn't looking." Letitia begins to speak slowly, and yet, at the same time, she reaches out her hand to Lionel. With a slight shyness and happiness in her eyes, she carefully places her hand on his head and strokes it softly, adding, "You are truly wonderful." Lionel was stunned. He froze, stopping the movement with the cup, not expecting such a gesture from Letitia. Letitia continues to stroke Lionel's head, as if oblivious to what is happening around her. Realizing what she was doing, she abruptly pulled her hand away, her face flushing. "Oh, I'm sorry." In a rush to hide her embarrassment, she tries to change the subject. "Soon, aren't classes? Let's go." Lionel quietly said, Let's go, yes?" Let's interrupt, trying to avoid further awkwardness. Lionel, slightly lowering his head and holding his hand on his neck, sadly whispers, "You could have touched longer." Letitia, frowning slightly, is about to ask again, "Oh, what do you..." However, Lionel gently interrupts her. "Shall we go to class?" They walk down the corridor, their steps echoing off the walls. Letitia runs up to him with interest, looks into his face and says, "I really didn't hear you. Say it again." Lionel replies with a slight grin. Then try to guess. Letitia, lost in thought, puts her finger to her lips. Do you have an itch?" Lionel laughs quietly, his voice warmer than usual. "No, of course not. Since I started spending time with Mr. Lionel, some strange things have happened." Thoughtfully flashed through her thoughts. The first, Alexia's gaze became even more frightening than before. Especially on the day when Mr. Lionel came to meet me, her gaze literally burned the air. Second, the exercises that Letitia had taught Lionel had spread among the knights of the Legrand estate. Now they too were repeating the strange movements that they had previously considered useless. Third, yummy! The range of sweets at the Legrand estate has become much more varied. Lionel watches Letitia with a kind smile as she eats with pleasure. Mrs. Letitia always eats so appetizingly, ma'am. No matter how much I watch, I never get tired of her. Letitia suddenly breaks away from the sweets with anger and says, It's all because your sweets are so delicious. I can't resist." Raising her finger, she points at Lionel with a serious expression. Now, Mr. Lionel, you eat too. He, holding back his laughter, answers with a slight smile. Good. A happy thought quietly sounds in her thoughts. Mr. Lionel now eats sweets whenever he wants. This cannot but please. Again, a view of the palace. Muffled sounds are heard from there. Dull blows and footsteps. Letitia, noticing that the boy was hitting himself, anxiously asks Lionel, who was holding a book in his hands, "Are you okay?" Lionel calmly answers, "Yes." He often stumbles and collides with something. Flashed through Letitia's thoughts. Remembering their first meeting, she thought, when we met, he also fell. It must be. Watching Lionel adjust his long hair, she comes to the conclusion, because his hair is blocking his view? With slight hesitation, she nevertheless says out loud, "Listen." As if giving advice, she says, "Why don't you get a haircut?" At that moment, Letitia's maid, Emma, as if reading her thoughts, suddenly grabs a pair of scissors. She quickly approaches Lionel and with a deft movement cuts off part of his hair. Letitia, standing behind, froze in complete bewilderment. With a terrified expression on her face, she exhales, Emma? Mr. Lionel? It looked impressive, but..." Letitia sadly looks down at the floor, where her cut red locks already lie, shimmering with a soft shine in the rays of the sun. Lionel stands with his back turned, hiding his emotions. Turning slowly, he holds his hand on his neck with slight awkwardness and asks, "How do I look?" The maid behind him calmly continues to do her hair as if nothing had happened. Letitia, as if seeing his eyes for the first time, says with bated breath, "Very beautiful." Lionel, slightly blushing, answers with a shy smile, "Ah ha ha, I'm flattered." He touches his remaining bangs, pushing them slightly to the side. A little shy, but with warmth in his voice he adds, "Now I can see you better." Letitia freezes as if enchanted by the depth of his gaze. They stood there for a long time staring at each other. At that moment, Letitia felt a slight sadness. Lionel, noticing her change in mood, looked at her with slight concern, not understanding what had happened. A thought flashed through her mind. In 3 years, Mr. Lionel will enter the Magic Academy, the setting of the scenario of that very autumn game. The way he is now does not correspond to his image in the game, but I am sure that he will be fine. An image of 2 Lionels appeared before her mind's eye. One, the one she had met for the first time, fragile and uncertain. The other, the current one, standing with his back to the first, strong and calm. If Mr. Lionel's development were to be rewritten, what would happen to me then? Letitia sits in a chair, and 3 maids fuss around her. One, holding a comb, says anxiously, "If we don't hurry, we won't make it. We need perfume." The second, thoughtfully, "Which decoration should I choose?" The third, picking up an elegant decoration, "Doesn't this shade suit you better?" Letitia, closing her eyes from all this fuss, listens to their arguments without interfering. "No, this one is better." "No, this one. Quickly, there is little time." At this moment, her voice sounds off-screen. "The reason why they are all so busy with me is simple. The birthday of His Highness the Prince, which I will attend." They enter the palace. The view opens up to a magnificent staircase, graceful balconies, and a ceiling decorated with intricate patterns that reflect the flickering lights. The guests stop to look at the luxury of the hall. More and more people are coming. The invited aristocrats are talking to each other. Light music is playing. Letitia's parents look around in admiration, enjoying the festive atmosphere. Alexia stands with obvious displeasure on her face, and Letitia is already thinking, anticipating the development of events. Putting her hand to her lips, Letitia ponders. The prince, one of the potential objects of choice in the game. An image pops into her mind. A happy Alexia next to the prince. In her thoughts, Alexia falls in love with him. And if the heroine chooses the prince, the villain in her awakens. Honestly, I'm so worried about what's going to happen. Mother turns to Alexia in a quiet voice. "Ah, it seems His Highness the Prince hasn't shown up yet. It's a shame, isn't it, Alexia?" Alexia answers briefly with a gloomy face. "What are you talking about?" Mother asks again quietly. "You said you wanted to meet him, didn't you?" Alexia answers irritably. "I'm not interested." Letitia is amazed and can't contain her emotions. "What? Not interested?" Alexia calmly asks again, as if she hadn't heard. "Huh?" A thought flashes through Letitia's mind. Didn't she act capricious before, wanting to see the handsome prince that everyone talks about so much? And then Letitia's attention is drawn to one of the greetings. Mr. Laurent. Thoughtfully watching what was happening, Letitia whispers to herself, "Oh, is this the one who brought up the topic of engagement with me?" She turns to Alexia, who is standing there with a slight, barely noticeable smile, watching what is happening. Letitia asks suspiciously, "What is that expression on her face?" Alexia, as if she had not heard, asks again, "Huh?" Then, turning irritably to Letitia, Alexia says, "We'll have to go to young Monsieur Laurent. They say they were too hasty with their engagement." Letitia lowers her gaze, answering sadly, "Ah, very well." While the girls are talking, the father stands nearby, looking down and with a slight thoughtful smile. He watches Letitia carefully. He gently places his hand on her head. "Thanks to you, Alexia was able to focus on her treatment. And the relationship with Prince Legrand's family has also improved. You have done well for the good of our family." Letitia, hearing these words, looked at her father in surprise. Looking down at the floor, she says quietly to herself, "For the good of the family." Sad thoughts pierce her. Be that as it may, my engagement to Monsieur Lionel is just a political move. Anxiety grows inside. Maybe he is so kind to me only for the good of his family? Her heart begins to beat faster, giving no rest to new doubts. 3 girls in bright outfits suddenly run into the room, their hair styled in exquisite hairstyles and smiles shining on their faces. They turn to Alexia. "Long time no see, Mrs. Alexia." Their parents enter after them, immediately striking up a conversation with Letitia's family. "Is this really Count Lambert?" "How many years, how many winters?" they answer, exchanging greetings. Meanwhile, the girls continue their conversation next to their parents. One of them, as if caring, asks Alexia, "Was everything all right with you? You haven't been attending receptions lately." I started to worry. With slight sarcasm, her gaze slides to Letitia. "It's been a long time since we've seen each other, Madame Letitia." Alexia, standing tall and confident, gives them a beaming smile. Her friends look at her with admiration. "Oh, what a dress! Was it really made by that famous designer?" With a slight smug smile, Alexia answers, emphasizing her importance. "That's right. My magic teacher was closely acquainted with that designer." Her friends, amazed, exchange glances. "The teacher himself recognized you? He is famous for his strictness, right?" The girls' gazes turn to Letitia again. "So, does that mean that Mrs. Letitia also has a teacher like that?" Letitia, trying not to show her embarrassment, answers with slight shyness while maintaining a strained smile. "A regular everyday dress? I don't have a magic teacher." The girls look at each other in amazement. One squeezes her hand to her chest, another touches her cheek, and the third stands in a stupor with her hands down. Their thoughts sound the same. Although they are twins, how different they are. Letitia turns away to hide her feelings. A tear quietly rolls down her cheek. This is why I don't like receptions. The older sister is always in the spotlight, and I am just her simple shadow. I thought I was already used to these comparisons, but turning back, Letitia looks at everyone again with a forced smile, hiding the pain inside. She sees how her friends have surrounded Alexia, bombarding her with questions. When do you think His Highness the Prince will appear? Letitia stands aside, watching the lively conversations, remaining alone in her silence. Where should I go? Running out into the corridor, Letitia is finally alone. There's no one here. I can finally take a rest. She stops and tears start to flow down her cheeks again. Her voice breaks into a sob. I wish I could get home sooner. Oh. Suddenly, a guy appears next to her. His presence makes Letitia shudder. She did not notice how he approached, and all this time stood silently nearby. He says in a soft, calm voice, "You do not like this holiday?" Letitia turns around abruptly and sees him. His outfit is striking, dazzlingly bright and perfectly chosen, snow-white hair, and his eyes, they seem to shine like the lights of a night city. She freezes in thought, unable to look away. The first thought flashes through her mind. It's rare to meet someone like that. The guy turns to Letitia with a warm smile. You don't like this reception either? Is that why you're here? Letitia clenches her teeth, trying to hide her growing excitement. Ah, you've exposed me. It turns out that at least one person here was like that. flashed through her thoughts. Probably this young man was also forced to come here against his will. The guy continues the conversation, keeping his voice light. I thought that the ladies today are eagerly awaiting a meeting with His Highness the Prince, about whom they talk so much. Letizia, looking down at the floor, answers shyly. Ah, but after a moment she looks up and, already smiling with slight confidence, says, I think perhaps even His Highness the Prince himself is not enjoying this reception very much. Ladies excited by rumors can be a burden even to someone who is accustomed to attention. In the game, His Highness Cedric was a highly responsible and reliable prince. However, there was another side, one that despised people who flocked to him only for flattery. Perhaps this is why he was charmed by the heroine, who did not succumb to the influence of rumors and remained sincere. The guy, hiding his true identity, answers with interest in his voice. Oh yeah? Letitia turns away, but he continues to ask questions. Why do you think so? This time Letitia does not mince her words. She says directly, because I went through his branch. Well, rather it is just intuition, the guy says with a sly smile. You know, for making false statements about the prince, you can be arrested for insulting His Highness. Letizia instantly turns pale, her voice trembling with fear. How for insulting His Highness? In a panic, she comes closer to the guy, begging for mercy. Please, don't tell anyone about this. The guy, covering his mouth with his hand, holds back his laughter. Anxiety flashes through her thoughts. Is he laughing? Finally, with a light chuckle, he says, Okay. He turns to leave, but without taking his eyes off her, he adds with a warm smile, You are a nice person. After a short pause, he continues, That's why I'm not going to accuse you of anything. Letitia extends her hand to him with anxiety and uncertainty. Ah? His Highness Cedric? The boy enters the hall, and the crowd around him greets him with enthusiastic cries. It's His Highness the Prince! From the other side of the hall, a chorus is heard. Your Highness the Prince! Happy birthday! Letizia remains standing behind, unable to believe her eyes. She is stunned, her thoughts mixed with a growing sense of shame. Could it be that I spoke to the prince himself as if he were a simple acquaintance? Without embarrassment, without respect, Prince Cedric, standing in the center of the room, smiles with genuine joy. The guests greet him with jubilation, some even slightly shocked by his unexpected appearance. Thank you all for coming today, he says in a friendly voice. I apologize for the delay. Now let us have some fun. Letitia stays aside, hiding her face with her hands. Tears well up in her eyes again. This young man, is he really His Highness Cedric? The game didn't show him at such a young age. That's why I didn't recognize him right away. And what did I say in his presence? She goes back into the hall where the crowd is buzzing with discussion. Arrest for an untrue statement. That girl was standing next to His Highness? She is the younger sister of Madame Alexia, isn't she? Listen, they say she is engaged to a young gentleman from the Legrand family. Letizia, seeing that everyone is looking at her and discussing her in particular, covers her eyes and ears with her hands out of shame, so as not to see or hear anything. Having come to her senses a little, she carefully removes her hands from her ears and begins to listen to the conversations. In addition to being engaged to the young gentleman who was rejected by her sister, she has also set her sights on His Highness the Prince. It seems that she is a great lover of male attention. Hearing this, Letitia frowns, clenching her fists in displeasure. What have they come up with? She turns away but continues to listen. But no matter what she does, she can't surpass her sister, can she? Letitia turns back, watching carefully as people whisper behind her back. She barely even has any magic. She just collects the pitiful crumbs from others. She notices two girls whispering to each other. She and her sister have nothing in common, says one. A mistake of nature, adds the other, exchanging glances with the guy next to her. Letitia can't take it anymore and, exploding with emotion, exclaims, Stop it! At that moment, someone calls her. Madame Letizia? Turning around, she sees Lionel, who asks worriedly, Is everything okay? Letitia, with surprise and wide eyes, Mr. Lionel? At this moment, the attention of all the guests in the hall switches to them. Isn't this the young gentleman from the Legrand family? Is heard from the crowd. It can't be. And she's with him? Lionel, noticeably taller and more confident than before, says with a slight smile, "It turns out I don't have any things in my size, so I was a little late." Two girls run up to him. One of them asks with a coquettish smile, "Excuse me, are you my Lord Legrand? We have met before. Do you remember me?" Letitia and Lionel are perplexed, trying to understand what they are talking about. Lionel thinks, remembering details of the past. A moment later, he says with a slight note of calm in his voice, "Long time no see, daughters of the Count of Orleans and the Marquis of Cale." The girls, as if suddenly infatuated with him again, say with a shy smile, "So you still remember us?" "Of course," he answers shortly. Coming closer to them, Lionel continues with a slight chill in his voice. "The last time we talked about the engagement, you only made fun of my appearance. However, I am grateful to you." The girls lower their eyes in shame. One, standing behind her friend, looked at him in surprise, and the other, folding her palms in front of her, even shed a tear. Suddenly, to the surprise of everyone present, Lionel takes Letitia by the hand. "Thanks to your refusal," he drops to one knee and tenderly kisses her hand, continuing, "I was able to meet Mrs. Letitia." Letitia looks at him in confusion, not expecting such a gesture. She meets his gaze, as warm and sincere as on the day of their first meeting. Lionel looks up at her, no longer hiding his feelings. His smile is full of tenderness and respect, and his gaze is deep and full of determination. Letitia, agitated, not knowing how to react to this gesture, says with a trembling voice, Mr. Lionel." The room starts whispering again. The discussions are growing. Did she really find such a peaceful life after all this? Letitia Lambert? Is it her? The prince, standing in the center with a glass in his hand, watches the scene, and his expression becomes darker. A mixture of disappointment and slight envy can be read in his eyes. The whispers continue. How charming do you have to be to make such a man bow before you? These happy moments. Now her fate is linked to Mr. Lionel. Alexia, watching what is happening, cannot hide the anger and envy that are reflected on her face. Letitia, now the center of attention, no longer pays attention to other people's gossip. Even with beads of sweat running down her temples from excitement, she thinks with unexpected confidence, I am attracting more attention than anyone else in this place right now. Lionel sat in silence, staring thoughtfully at one point. The thought that had haunted him since childhood surfaced again. I don't like people. He settled himself in his chair by the large window, beyond which a serene view of the garden spread out. The inspiring picture outside did not bring him peace. Memories, like shadows of the past, did not give him peace. A man with a reserved expression entered the room. I apologize for distracting you from your studies, my lord, but fencing lessons will begin soon. Lionel broke free from the captivity of his own thoughts and reluctantly tore his gaze away from the window. Ah, I'm already on my way. The lesson began. The part of the garden where the training took place was filled with the metallic ringing of intersecting blades. Lionel held his saber confidently, but his thoughts were far from discipline and technique. Waving his weapon, he again sank into thought, I don't like people. The inner voice continued to grow louder. I was born into a family of dukes. Slander accompanied me day after day. People made fun of my appearance, questioned my abilities. Everything I did was ridiculed. A scene from his imagination appeared before his eyes. People in bright clothes, their faces hidden in shadows, only their disdainful glances visible. Their voices sounded like an echo of his fears. He has a large reserve of magic, but he does not even know how to control it. And this one will become a duke? This is the end of the Legrand line. Then Alexia appears before his inner eye. Her evil face and cold words penetrated straight into his soul. Everyone distorted their facial expressions when they saw me, Lionel thinks. But then the image of Alexia fades, giving way to another memory. Letitia. He remembers their first meeting, her eyes full of fire and determination. Hello, she said with a soft smile, but seeing his gaze, she hesitated a little. It's nice. She was different, Lionel thought. Feeling the warmth emanating from the memory, he remembers the moment when Letitia held his hand, leading him through the garden. Her gaze remained confident, full of trust. Only she looked me straight in the eyes. He remembers how she patiently taught him how to train, how to run, how to exercise, how to hone his endurance. I want to be the best person for her, he thought. Lionel turns his attention back to his saber. He continues training, trying to push his thoughts aside and focus on each movement of the blade. Suddenly, a voice breaks his concentration. "Mr. Lionel, forward!" He flinched, instantly alert, not understanding who had spoken. Turning around, he saw Letitia standing on the balcony. Her gaze was full of support and a slight smile. Lionel, not expecting her appearance, said with surprise and slight embarrassment, "Madam Letitia?" He lost his balance a little from surprise, hastily straightening his saber. The teacher approached him with a displeased look. "Concentrate, my lord." Lionel, embarrassedly lowering his gaze, apologized. "Sorry, I got distracted." The teacher only frowned at him, thinking to himself, "It seems that the young man's mood changes at the sight of this young lady." After finishing the training, Lionel approached Letitia, his face expressing slight surprise. "How long ago did you come?" he asked, frowning slightly. They sat down at a table in the shade of the garden trees. Letitia broke the silence, her voice sounding slightly sad, and her palms raised in an apology. "Sorry for interrupting your training. I didn't mean to distract you." Lionel, looking down, leaned his elbow on his knee and clasped his hand to support his head. His voice sounded calm, but with a hint of embarrassment. "Nothing terrible happened, so there's no need to apologize." He looked up sadly, still holding his head in the same position, and added thoughtfully, "It's just, when I realized you were here, I wanted to make a better impression." With these words, he sighed, as if releasing tension. "Ah," and barely audibly, as if by accident, he added, "Darling." Letitia looked at him in surprise. Her eyes widened wider than usual, and a slight shyness appeared on her face. Lionel, continuing to look into her eyes, thought, "Since the prince's birthday, I have the feeling that she treats me more and more consciously. It's so sweet. I want her to take me even more seriously." Letitia looked down, a slight sadness reflected on her face. Lionel, not taking his eyes off her, thought, "I want to touch her." Suddenly, her voice tore him out of his thoughts. "You have such a large reserve of magic, and you are strong in your own right. Why did you decide to take up fencing as well?" These words brought back to his memory the events of the prince's birthday. The evening of that day. The guests gradually left. The carriages were waiting for them at the palace courtyard. The atmosphere of farewells was filled with light bustle and social etiquette. Letitia stood on the balcony, watching the people leave with a soft smile on her face. Turning to Lionel, she said, "Thank you for today." Lionel smiled back and asked, "What are you talking about?" Letitia sighed slightly, the memories resurfacing in her mind. "When the young ladies would make snide remarks about me." That moment flashed before her eyes, standing in the spotlight, hearing the poisonous words whispered, but loud enough to be impossible to ignore. No matter what she does, she can't surpass her sister, can she? "Those unpleasant moments from the past made me unable to move," she continued, a slight tremor in her voice. But then, turning her gaze to him, she said warmly, "But when I saw you, I calmed down." She laughed, trying to dispel the weight of the memories. "It's strange, isn't it? Lionel answered her with a slight smile. "No, I'm glad I could help you at least a little." The moment came to mind when she got into her carriage, waved to him with a warm smile, and headed home. Lionel, smiling in response, also raised his hand, but inside him was a completely different thought. If she had not been engaged to me, perhaps she would not have said anything like that. He remembered how, having arrived at the feast, he had accidentally overheard conversations in the courtyard. "This so-called lady is engaged to my Lord Legrand. She is Alexia Lambert's twin sister. I hope she will not lose her modesty, imagining herself to be God knows what because of this engagement." These words echoed in his mind. Letizia seems to be constrained in her respect in high society. Moreover, her engagement to me has had a bad effect on her. I want to protect Letizia, even if it means going against everyone around me. Their thoughts dissolved, leaving only the silence of the garden. Lionel returned to reality first, reaching out to Letitia with a soft expression on his face. My intention is not only to harden the body, but suddenly, with a lightness that he didn't expect, he gently cupped Letitia's cheeks. Her eyes widened in surprise, a mixture of shock and confusion on her face. Lionel continued, his voice softer, but his words unwaveringly determined. The primary reason is to be able to protect you, even without using magic. A slight blush of embarrassment appeared on her face, But Lionel, noticing this, quickly looked away and, smiling, said in an innocent tone, "I removed the leaf." Letizia, not expecting such a gesture, looked down in embarrassment and lightly touched her hair, as if trying to hide behind it. Her fingers nervously played with a strand, and her face showed shy confusion. Deep and conflicting emotions were boiling inside Lionel. Letitia did not want this engagement. Perhaps the very thought of it was unpleasant to her. But I have no intention of distancing myself. He clenched his fists, not allowing his emotions to come out. I will bear the name of Legrand with honor. I will become stronger so that no one will dare to hurt you. Letitia continued to look down, her eyes clouded with a slight sadness, and a slight blush did not leave her cheeks. Her silence was not a sign of alienation, but rather an uncertainty and fear of the future that she could not control. Lionel, gathering all his resolve, said quietly but firmly, "I want you to always be near." The words hung in the air, like a promise made not only to her, but to himself. 3 years passed. A majestic view of the palace, drowning in the rays of the setting sun, opened up before his eyes. Its high towers, surrounded by gardens, were reflected in the mirror-like surface of the fountains, as if reminding him of the eternity and greatness of the Legrand family. Confident, resonant steps echoed through the silence of the corridors. Heavy boots echoed off the marble walls. Someone was returning home after a long absence. Seeing the man approaching, the maids, with joy mixed with surprise, exclaimed, bowing their heads in a respectful bow, "Welcome back, Monsieur Lionel." Lionel, who had changed noticeably over the years, had grown taller. His features had acquired a mature beauty, and his gaze was pierced by a slight sadness. Nodding reservedly, he answered briefly, "Uh-huh." He passed by the maids, and they, barely managing to raise their heads, exchanged loving glances and rapturous sighs, barely containing their joy. As beautiful as always, Lionel quickened his pace, hurrying towards his goal. The maids, unable to hide their admiration, excitedly called out after him, "Madame Letizia is waiting for you in the room." There was surprise in their voices. "It sped up." Yes, it really sped up. Did you see?" Without wasting any time, Lionel walked up to the door of the room and opened it without hesitation. Letitia, who was sitting by the window, heard footsteps and turned around. The same warm sparkle still shimmered in her eyes. Seeing him, she exclaimed joyfully, holding a fork with a cake, "Monsieur Lionel!" He answered her with a light, sincere smile, a shadow of tenderness flashing in his eyes. "Thank you for waiting, Mrs. Letizia." Sitting down at the table next to her, he said with a soft smile, looking at the treats, "They brought you a lot of sweets again, didn't they?" Letitia was a little embarrassed, looking down at her hands. "It's all the maids. They didn't let me get bored while I was waiting for you." She began to tell with a smile how the maids vied with each other to persuade her to try different sweets. "Madame Letizia, try this, and this one, please." Lionel laughed, answering softly, "That's because you look so happy when you try them." She, blushing slightly, admitted, "They're just always so delicious." At that moment, Lionel gently took her hand, in which she held a fork with a piece of cake speared on it. He looked into her eyes and said in a gentle voice, "Let me try it." Without taking his eyes off her, he slowly leaned down and carefully took a piece from her fork, lightly touching her fingers with his lips. Letitia froze, feeling nervous and embarrassed by such an unexpected gesture. He, still slowly, came even closer. Their faces were only a few centimeters apart. Raising his eyes, he looked straight into her soul. Letitia, visibly nervous, quietly, "B." Unable to bear the tension, she pulled away abruptly, blushing to the tips of her ears, and almost screamed, covering her face with her hands, "Close!" Lionel, maintaining his calm and gentle smile, as if nothing special had happened, said calmly, Delicious." Letitia felt her heart pounding in her chest. Her thoughts raced with excitement. "He has become so relaxed lately. My heart won't take it." Her consciousness involuntarily began to return to the past. Images of childhood days surfaced in her memories. Then Lionel was sweet, shy, with a soft smile and kind eyes. An inner voice whispered to her, "In childhood it was so touching. But now, well, he has not lost his beauty, but..." Images of adult Lionel, confident and strong, sharply contrasted with those memories. He was no longer the boy from her memories, but a man whose presence made her lose herself in her feelings. Her thoughts became more and more anxious and sad, Her gaze dropped. A slight shadow of despair was reflected on her face. Where is that pretty Mr. Lionel? But despite these doubts, deep inside she understood. In front of her was still the same Lionel, just matured, become stronger. Only now he was able to touch not only her hand, but also her heart. The camera pans over an elegantly laid table, with plates, silver forks, and a delicate porcelain teapot, steam rising from it. The atmosphere is calm but tense, as if the silence itself is hiding unresolved issues. Letitia secretly watches Lionel, who seems to be completely lost in his thoughts. Her inner voice, filled with slight sadness, sounds off-screen. Mr. Lionel entered the Academy of Magicians this year, and I, who studied in the same class with Alexia, still have not entered. The game scenario has not yet begun. Letitia continued in her thoughts. I would like to know more about the situation at the academy, but apparently he is too busy with his studies. We see each other so little. This week is our first meeting. Now it will always be like this until I get accepted, right? Sadness slowly takes hold of her. She lowers her head and her gaze becomes sad. What a depressing feeling. Raising her head, Letitia, trying to hide her emotions, asks with a slight but uncertain smile, "How are you doing at the academy?" Lionel is silent at first, and then, lost in thought, slowly begins to speak. At the academy, he pauses for a moment, as if remembering something tiresome. Scenes from the academy appear in his mind. Two girls watching him lovingly, one of them asking, "Mr. Lionel, could you explain this moment to me?" Lionel is inwardly irritated. How annoying they are! Throwing these thoughts aside, he looks at Letitia again with a slight smile. Ah, I did well on the exam the other day. True, because of that I had to communicate with a lot of people. It was quite difficult. Letitia, listening attentively, nods. I understand. A thought appears in her mind. Such an attractive young man will definitely not go unnoticed. With a smile, recalling the past, Letitia thinks, and at the birthday party of His Highness the Prince, 3 years ago, he was one of the public's favorites. And now, whoever looks at him, everyone considers him a real handsome man. He has become a real gem, but a shadow of sadness and hidden jealousy appears in her eyes. I'm sure there are enough wonderful girls at the academy. She paints a picture in her mind, Lionel smiling at a happy, beautiful girl. Anxiety grows inside her. What if he meets the one, falls in love with her? In that case, I, a mere political bride, will only become a hindrance to him. Lionel notices her tension. Her gaze has become absent-minded and her expression is anxious. He notices how she nervously clutches a piece of her dress with her fingers. Lionel, slightly alarmed, asks in a soft voice, "Madame Letitia?" She continues to sit as if she doesn't hear him, lost in her thoughts. He leans a little closer, his voice becoming caring. "What are you thinking about?" Letitia snaps back to reality, raising her hands slightly in fear. "Oh, nothing like that." Anxiety grows inside her. Her thoughts are confused. What should I tell him? I can't just smile. Finally, thinking it over, she turns away, hiding her emotions, and says quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm not feeling well today. I should leave." She rises from her seat, gradually walking towards the exit. And behind her, she hears his voice, full of concern. "Mrs. Letitia." He quickly catches up with her, his voice full of determination. "Be honest with me." She slowly looks up, looking at him with half-closed eyes, as if asking for understanding, but not finding the strength to articulate the real reason for her pain. Letitia slowly returns to her seat, crossing her arms over her chest as if trying to protect herself from her own thoughts. Lionel, noticing her state, says with gentleness in his voice, "You have become even more magnificent. You are attractive, erudite, and your stock of magic is great in comparison to me." Letitia is nervous, crumpling the bow on her dress, looking down. A desperate thought sounds in her thoughts. I have no talents, and I do not possess magic, just an insignificant background character from whom no one expects anything. Lost in her despondency, she quietly says to Lionel, without raising her eyes, "A person like me cannot always be near such a shining personality." Lionel, hearing this, was slightly embarrassed by her words. Letitia, clasping her hands to her chest and closing her eyes from the sadness that had washed over her, continues, "I don't want to be a burden for you." The more I tried not to dwell on such thoughts, the stronger the irritation and feeling of inferiority became. Lionel listens to her in silence, and for a moment it seems that he does not know what to answer. Letitia, noticing his silence, says with a strained smile, "I apologize for such a sudden revelation. You probably did not want to hear something like this, right?" Suddenly, Lionel grabs her hand, his voice firm and warm. "You're wrong." Letitia, struck by this gesture, looks at him in surprise. He, without looking away, with a slight sadness in his eyes, continues, "Everything that I have achieved thanks to you." She can't take her eyes off him, absorbed in his words, and he, still holding her hand tightly, continues, "I tried so hard only because you were there." Lionel slowly brings her hand to his face, pressing it to his cheek, and then gently kisses the back of her hand. "You saved me, so please don't talk about yourself like that." Letitia, listening to his words, shudders inwardly from surprise. A thought full of amazement and confusion echoes in her thoughts. "I saved Monsieur Lionel?" They sit side by side, surrounded by silence and their own feelings. Lionel continues to hold Letitia's hand, not letting go for a moment. Letitia, looking down, finally decides to reveal what she has been keeping to herself for a long time. "Oh, and because you are now studying at the academy, we rarely see each other." Lionel listens to her attentively, quietly answering, "Uh-huh." She continues, her voice a little quieter. "Because of this, I missed you." He again softly confirms, without interrupting, "Uh-huh." Gathering her courage, Letitia, with anxiety in her voice, exhales the most terrible confession for herself. "And I thought that you might have liked other young ladies." At that moment, Lionel suddenly hugs her tightly, as if he had been waiting for these words all this time, and a happy smile appears on his face. "Mrs. Letitia, I was also sad because we couldn't see each other. But I have never seen a lady more beautiful than you." Letitia is still worried about revealing herself to him, but inside her heart is filled with warm happiness. Lionel, not letting go of her, continues softly, "Madam Letitia." His hand gently touches her hair. He comes so close that their breath merges into one. Looking straight into her eyes with a gentle smile, Lionel asks, "Can I assume that you like me?" Letitia, meeting his gaze, holds her breath for a moment. Then, sighing shyly, she says in her mind, "Ah, it's true. I like Monsieur Lionel." He stays close, not taking his eyes off her, continuing to hold her tightly in his arms, as if afraid of losing this moment. His embrace becomes even tighter, and Letitia's eyes widen in surprise. She says with difficulty, "Mr. Lionel?" But he quietly, with frank sadness, answers, "I always thought that my feelings were not mutual." Lionel moves even closer. His palm gently touches her cheek, and his finger slowly slides over her lips. Their noses touch, and he looks at her with infinite tenderness. Finally, he kisses her. This time, Letitia does not resist. She reciprocates his kiss without fear or surprise, completely surrendering to this moment. A surprised but happy thought sounds in her thoughts. "I didn't even dare to imagine that he thought that way about me." But before she can finish her thoughts, Lionel kisses her again, this time more passionately. He hugs her so tightly that Letitia can hardly contain the blush that spreads across her cheeks. Trying to get out of his embrace, she exhales with difficulty. "Gee, Mr. Lionel." Pushing him away from her, she coughs, trying to recover from the sudden outburst. Lionel, with a beaming smile and sparkling eyes, looks at her and says softly, "I'm sorry." Letitia, looking at Lionel with tenderness and slight affection, as if seeing him in a new light for the first time, says with a soft smile, "I'm definitely not feeling bad." Suddenly, Lionel squeezes her hand tighter. Letitia, frightened by the unexpected movement, cries out, "Ah!" Before she knows what's happening, she's in his arms. Lionel, not taking his eyes off her, holds her tightly, as if protecting her from the whole world, but at the same time holding her hand in his with trepidation. He kisses her tenderly on the forehead and says in a soft, almost whispering tone, "I would like to sit like this forever." Letitia, blushing and looking down, says with slight embarrassment, "Mr. Lionel." Lionel interrupts her with a kind smile, as if he already knew what she wanted to say. Was he so assertive? He continues with a slight playfulness in his voice, "Mrs. Letitia," with a smirk and half-closed eyes, as if teasing her with a little intrigue, he asks, "Will you go on a date with me next weekend?" The camera mentally moves to the view of the palace. Light sounds of music and voices are heard through the windows, creating an atmosphere of expectation and anticipation of new events. At this time, Letitia is talking to her maid, Ima. She, with her eyes closed and her hand resting on her forehead, finally sighs with relief, as if having waited for the long-awaited moment. "Madam Letitia, is it really you? Finally?" Emma opens one eye and adds with a slight mockery, "Are you going on a date with Mr. Lionel?" The maid's mood becomes playful and mischievous. She waves her hands as if casting a spell, smiling, and says, "I will use all my strength to help you in this, still unclear matter." Letitia laughs, slightly embarrassed by her words, and gratefully replies, "Thank you for being able to rely on you, Ima." Ima carefully places a soft pink dress on Letitia, which perfectly emphasizes her tenderness and sophistication. "How do you like it?" Letitia, feeling a slight joy, but not hiding her embarrassment, says, "Isn't it too revealing?" Here she freezes for a moment, immersed in her thoughts. So this really is not a dream. Remembering that very kiss, she, as if containing her own feelings within herself, quietly but confidently completes her thought. "I, with Monsieur Lionel." Letitia's thoughts are suddenly interrupted by the voice of the maid Emma. She, slightly tilting her head to the side, asks curiously, "Mistress Letitia, what are you thinking about so deeply?" Letitia, suddenly startled and opening her eyes wide, quickly answers, blushing, "Nothing!" Meanwhile, Alexia, having learned about what is happening, clenches her fists in irritation. Her gaze becomes cold and focused. A single, furious thought flashes through her head. "Letitia,